I still remember the day I received the letter. The moment when everything was about to change. It was in my mailbox, a plain white envelope with the golden logo of my dream college, the place I was rushing to with all my heart. My fingers trembled as I tore the paper open, and there, in black and white, was the words, "Congratulations, you have been enrolled." I stood in the middle of the kitchen, holding that letter, and felt my chest swell with happiness. Everything I had been burning for, the nights over books, the tears over exams, that stupid enthusiasm that made me paint the future in colors, all of it had finally become real. I imagined the campus, the new faces, the freedom. I was 18, and I was ready to escape from this stuffy town where every day smelled like monotony. And then everything fell apart. My parents were sitting at the table when I flew into the kitchen, waving the letter like a victory flag. My mom didn't even look up from her coffee. Dad mumbled something about the newspaper. I exclaimed, "I'm in. I'm going," and waited for them to be happy for me for once in my life. But my mom slowly put down her cup, and my dad rolled up the newspaper with a sound like he was closing a door. "We talked," she said, her voice as cold as the damn air conditioner humming in the corner. At first I thought she was joking. A stupid, meaningless joke. But then my dad added, "Grandma is sick. Very sick. We are moving to Florida to be near her. And they need you there." I stood there, clutching the letter in my hand, and felt it bend under my grip. "But what about college?" I squeezed out, my voice trembling like a child asking not to have a toy taken away. My mom sighed, as if I were annoying her. "Family comes first," she said. "Do you want Grandma to die alone?" It was a punch in the face. I tried to argue. I told them that there were nurses, that I could come on weekends, that I deserved this chance. But they looked at me like I was an ungrateful, selfish person. My dad got up and started pacing the kitchen, throwing out phrases about duty, about how they had raised me all my life, and now I want to leave the family. My mom added that college was not going anywhere, that I could go later. But I knew it was a lie. Chances like this don't wait. They slip away like sand through your fingers, and you are left empty-handed. I was screaming. I cried. I begged. But they were unyielding. Dad said he had already arranged to sell the house. Mom started making a list of things to take to Florida. My letter lay on the table, crumpled and forgotten, and I felt everything I had built in my head collapse like a house of cards in a gust of wind. I asked myself, why me? Why not them? Why not someone else? But the answer was simple and cruel: you are young. You still have everything ahead of you. And Grandma is now. That night, I lay in bed, looking at the ceiling, and tried to imagine what my life would look like in Florida. The heat, the swamp, the smell of medicine, and the sound of my grandmother's moans. I knew she was sick, cancer, terminal, but I had no idea that this would be my sentence. My friends wrote to me, congratulating me on college, and I couldn't answer. How could I say that I wasn't going? That my dreams had been trampled on for the sake of the family? I hated them at that moment. My parents. My grandmother. I hated myself for not being able to just get up and leave. A week later, we were packing our bags. I watched my old bike, which I used to ride to school, being thrown into a truck. My books were shoved into boxes as if they weighed nothing. My mom said that in Florida I would be able to help, and that word sounded like a chain tightening around my neck. Dad was silent, but I could see something like guilt in his eyes. But it didn't make me feel any better. When we got into the car and started driving, I took one last look at our house. At the place where I was myself. And I thought, what have I lost forever? My dreams? My freedom? Or something more? I didn't know. But I felt that this was just the beginning of some long, painful fall. And I couldn't stop it. Florida greeted me with a punch of heat right in the face. We got out of the car after a long drive, 12 hours in a cramped cabin that smelled like gasoline and my mother's perfume, and I felt the air burn my lungs. It was humid, sticky, as if someone had covered me with a hot blanket and told me to breathe through it. My grandmother's house stood in the middle of this hell, old, peeling, with yellowed paint and humming fans that drove hot air in circles. I stood there with my suitcase in my hands, looking at it, and thought, this is my new world. My prison. The first days were like a dream you can't wake up from. We were unpacking, or rather, I was unpacking. Mom and Dad immediately started organizing, their word for giving me instructions while they drank coffee on the veranda. Take this to Grandma, clean up there, make sure she's not cold. I lugged boxes, wiped sweat from my forehead, and tried not to look at my phone, where my friends were sending photos from their first days at college. Their smiles, new dorms, parties, it was all like a knife in the back. I deleted all the messages. I couldn't stand the fact that they were moving forward and I was stuck here in this swamp. My grandmother was lying in her room, connected to some tubes, with an oxygen mask on her face. Her skin was as thin as paper, and her eyes were dull but still sharp. She barely spoke, only wheezing when I brought her water or adjusted her pillow. I did not know how to treat her. On the one hand, I felt sorry for her, she was weak, sick, lonely. On the other hand, I was angry. She's the reason I'm here. Because of her, my life stopped. And I hated myself for these thoughts, but they wouldn't go away. My parents quickly disappeared from the picture. Dad found a hobby for himself. He sat with local men in a bar a couple of blocks away, drinking beer and complaining about life. Mom signed up for some yoga classes to relieve stress. And me? I became a nurse. I brought medicine, changed the sheets, listened to my grandmother cough so hard that the walls shook. I had no time to even breathe, let alone think about myself. I spent my nights flipping through old photos on my phone, remembering how things could have been. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw only this stuffy room and heard her wheezing. One evening I tried to talk to my mom. She was sitting in the kitchen, flipping through a healthy lifestyle magazine, and I said, I feel sick here. I can't do this. She didn't even look at me. She just mumbled, we all make sacrifices. You'll get used to it. I felt a lump in my throat and walked away. Get used to it. To what? To this feeling of being buried alive. My father was even worse. When I tried to complain to him, he just waved his hand and said, life is not a fairy tale. Grow up. The heat in Florida became my enemy. It penetrated everywhere, my hair, my skin, my thoughts. I would wake up with a pillow wet with sweat and go check on my grandmother, who was moaning in pain. The doctors came once a week, threw in a few words about stable condition, and left. I was left alone with her weak breathing and the smell of antiseptic that permeated everything around. Sometimes I stood on the threshold of her room and thought, what if I just ran away? I took a bus and went somewhere where no one would find me. But where? And on what? I had no money, no plan. Just this damn suitcase and the feeling that I was drowning. The days merged into one gray blur. I lost track of time. My hands smelled like medicine and my eyes stung from fatigue. One day, I found my letter from college, the one that was crumpled up and stuffed in a box of things. I opened it and read it again. Congratulations. The word sounded like a mockery. I put it back and went to make my grandmother soup because she couldn't eat anything solid. Sometimes I stood in the backyard, looking at the swamp behind the house. The mosquitoes were buzzing there, and the sun was so hot that the ground was cracking. I imagined dropping everything and jumping into that water, just to feel something other than this numbness. But I came back to the house. I always came back. Because what else could I do? And then one evening, when I was sitting next to my grandmother, wiping her forehead, she suddenly grabbed my hand. Her fingers were weak, but her grip was strong. She looked at me with those sharp eyes and wheezed something I couldn't hear. I leaned closer, and she squeezed harder. It seemed to me that she wanted to say something. Something important. But I didn't understand. I thought, will these sacrifices break me? Or can I still get out? Time in Florida stretched like molten asphalt under the sun. Days turned into weeks, and I couldn't tell how long it had been. 2 months, 3. My hands got used to the smell of the medicine, the weight of my grandmother's pillows, her faint wheezing, which became the soundtrack of my life. I stopped expecting anything to change. My parents had completely drifted away, my mom went to her yoga sessions, my dad disappeared into the bar, and I was tied to this house, this room, this disease that was eating my grandmother from the inside. But then something happened. Something I didn't expect. It started with small things. One day, I brought her a glass of water, and she didn't just nod like she always did, but held my gaze. Her eyes, though clouded with pain, suddenly cleared. She waved her hand, weakly but insistently, for me to sit down next to her. I sat down, not knowing what to expect. And then she spoke. Not in a hoarse voice, not in fragments, but with real words, albeit quiet as the whisper of the wind. "You are like me," she said. I froze. It was the first thing she had said to me in a long time, other than fetch or pick up. I didn't know what to say. I just sat there, holding the glass, and listened to her slowly, with pauses, tell me about herself. How she was young, how she dreamed of becoming an artist, of painting the ocean and the sky. How her parents, my great-grandfathers, told her that this was nonsense, that she should get married and have children. I listened to them, she said, her voice trembling, and then I regretted it all my life. I felt something tighten in my chest. Her words were like a mirror, and I was afraid to look into it. After that day, she started talking more often. Not always a lot, sometimes just a few phrases, but every time it was something that sank into my soul. She talked about her youth in the same house, about how she loved to walk barefoot on the grass, how she once ran away to the beach and spent the whole night there, looking at the stars. Her voice was weak, but you could feel the strength in it, not the kind that screams, but the kind that burns quietly even when everything around it goes out. And I began to notice that I was waiting for these moments. That I liked sitting next to her, listening, imagining her life. One day she asked me to bring her an old box from the closet. I found it, worn, dusty, with the smell of old paper. Inside were yellowed drawings, waves, seagulls, sunset over the water. They were simple but alive, as if she had breathed a part of herself into them. "This is mine," she said, touching one sheet with trembling fingers. I asked her why she stopped painting. She was silent for a long time and then said, "Because they told me it was not important." I felt anger not at her, but at everyone who had broken her come to my throat. And at myself. Because I had allowed myself to be broken too. We started spending more time together. I read her books that I found in her dresser, old novels about adventure and love. Sometimes she would fall asleep to my voice, and sometimes she would listen to the end and smile, weakly but sincerely. I began to notice in her not just a sick old woman, but a person. A woman who used to laugh, love, and dream. And I felt a warmth towards her that I had not expected. She became not a burden for me, but someone more. Someone who understood me, even though she didn't say it directly. But my parents did not see it. They would come into the house, say a few words about the weather or food, and leave. Once my mom said, "You're doing a good job," and it sounded like I was a hired hand, not their daughter. Dad stopped looking me in the eye altogether. I was boiling with anger. They left me here and went on with their lives as if nothing had happened. And me? I was drowning in this swamp, but not alone, with my grandmother. One evening she said something strange. I was adjusting her blanket when she grabbed my hand, just like she did then, but this time harder. "I'll fix it," she whispered. I leaned in to hear her, but she only repeated herself, "I'll fix it." Her eyes sparkled not with pain, but with something else. With determination. I felt a chill go down my spine. What did she mean by that? What plan could she have? She could barely move. But something in her voice made me think. That night I lay in bed, looking at the ceiling, and thought about her words. About her drawings. About the way she looked at me, as if she knew more than she was saying. And for the first time in a long time, I felt not only pain and fatigue, but something like intrigue. Something was smoldering inside me, weak, but alive. Maybe she was really up to something. Maybe these were not just the words of a sick person. I didn't know. But for the first time in months, I fell asleep not with an emptiness in my chest, but with a question: what is she hiding? My grandmother died quietly. It happened one morning when the sun was just starting to peek through the cracks in the blinds. I went into her room with a cup of herbal tea, which she loved, and saw that she was not breathing. Her arms were on top of the blanket, calm, and her face, for the first time in a long time, was not contorted by pain. I stood there, holding that cup, and felt everything inside me freeze. There were no tears, no screaming, only emptiness, which spread over me like water over dry ground. I didn't know what to do, so I just sat down next to her and looked at her. Maybe for an hour. Maybe more. When I finally called my parents, they came running in looking like they were caught off guard. My mom started to cry, my dad mumbled something about an ambulance, but I knew it was over. The doctors came, pronounced her dead, and took her away. Everything happened quickly, like in a fog. I remember only the smell of antiseptic that remained in the room and the sound of my mother's sobs, which seemed to me to be somehow played out. And me? I just stood there, feeling like everything that kept me here had just disappeared. The funeral was 3 days later. A small ceremony at the local cemetery, a few old neighbors who barely remembered my grandmother, and us, the silent trio standing over the coffin. My mom was wiping her eyes with a handkerchief, my dad had his hands in his pockets, and I was looking at the ground and thinking about her drawings. About how she said she would fix everything. I didn't cry. I couldn't. All I felt was tired and some strange relief mixed with guilt. She was gone, and I was free. But at what cost? And then came the blow. A week after the funeral, a man in a suit came to the house, thin, with gray hair and a briefcase in his hands. He introduced himself as my grandmother's lawyer. I was sitting on the couch, my mom and dad were opposite, and we were all waiting for him to say something about debts or taxes. But he opened the folder and started reading. The will was drawn up 3 months ago, he said in a dry voice. All property, including the house, land, and savings, is transferred to the granddaughter. He called my name. Slowly, clearly, as if he had hit the table with a hammer. I felt the air in the room become heavy. My mom froze with her mouth open, and my dad leaned forward as if he hadn't heard. Everything to me. The lawyer continued, a house that was worth more than I could have imagined, a piece of land near the swamp that turned out to be valuable because of some development project, and a bank account that made me dizzy. $1 million. $1 million. From my grandmother, who was lying in bed and barely moving. I sat there, wringing my hands, trying to make sense of it. How? Where did it come from? Why me? My parents exploded at the same time. My mom screamed, "This is a mistake. She couldn't have." Dad jumped to his feet, demanding to see the documents. The lawyer calmly handed over the papers, and I saw their faces turn pale. My grandmother's signature was faint, but genuine. The date is 3 months ago, when I was already here, when she squeezed my hand and whispered about corrections. I remembered her eyes, that sparkle, and realized, she knew. She had planned this. Mom turned to me, her voice trembling with anger. "Did you know something? Did you talk her into it?" I shook my head, still in shock, but she didn't listen. Dad started pacing the room, muttering about ingratitude and injustice. I sat silently, looking at them, and felt everything turning upside down. They thought it was theirs. That the house, the money, everything was theirs by right. And my grandmother gave it to me. To me, who they threw here like a dog on a chain. The lawyer left, leaving a copy of the will and saying that he would contact me to formalize it. And I stayed with them, with my parents, who looked at me as if I had stolen something from their pocket. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, looking at the ceiling, and thought about my grandmother. How she was lying in that room, weak but cunning. She saw what they did to me. And she gave me a chance. But why? To take revenge on them? To save me? Or just because I was the only one who listened to her? The next day I found her drawings in a box. I looked through them, touching the yellowed edges, and felt the tears finally coming. She left me not just money. She left me herself, her story, her dreams, her strength. But what am I supposed to do with it? And how do I look into the eyes of my parents, who are sitting behind the wall whispering about how to get it all back? I heard their voices, tense, angry, confused. And I thought, how will they justify themselves? How will they explain what they did to me when the truth comes out? After the lawyer left, the house looked like a battlefield. Only instead of screaming and punching, there was silence, thick, sticky, and more suffocating than any Florida heat. My parents walked around me like predators waiting for the moment to jump, but I felt like they didn't know where to start. I sat in the kitchen, holding a cup of cold coffee, and stared at the will in front of me. $1 million. A house. The land. Mine. And their eyes, drilling into me from across the room, screamed one thing: how dare you? My mom made the first move. She walked into the kitchen the next morning as I was making myself breakfast, just toast, because I hadn't had an appetite since the funeral. Her voice was sweet as syrup, but I could hear it trembling with tension. "We're so happy for you," she said, sitting down across from me. I almost dropped the knife. Deserved it? A week ago she had called me selfish for daring to ask about college. And now I deserved it. I remained silent, watching her twist the ring awkwardly on her finger. Dad joined us in the evening. He brought a beer, not for me, for himself, and began his speech while sitting on the veranda. "We've always supported your dreams," he said, looking past me. "You know how hard we've worked for you." I felt anger rising in my throat, hot and prickly. supported. When they made me give up everything. When my dad yelled at me for being ungrateful and my mom told me college could wait. I clenched my fists under the table and asked quietly, "So why did you drag me here?" He blinked, as if he wasn't expecting this, and mumbled something about family, about duty. But I could see his eyes darting. He was lying. And he knew I knew it. The following days were a theater of the absurd. My mom suddenly started cooking my favorite food, chocolate pancakes, which I hadn't eaten since childhood, and served them with a smile that made me sick to my stomach. My dad pulled an old college magazine from the bar and threw it on the table, saying, "Maybe you should think about where to go." I looked at them and couldn't believe it. Are these the same people who crushed my dreams like an insect under a shoe? Those who left me to rot in this house while they lived their lives. And now they always supported me. Anger grew inside me like a storm. I remembered everything. How my mom would sigh when I asked for a day off from caring for my grandmother. How my dad waved his hand as I cried in the car on the way to Florida. How they didn't even ask if I was okay when I spent the night at my grandmother's bedside, listening to her moans. And now that I had something of my own, something that my grandmother had given to me, not to them, they suddenly remembered that I was their daughter. I was boiling. Every word they said was like gasoline to the fire burning in my chest. One evening I couldn't take it anymore. My mother started her song again, about how they sacrificed for me and how I could now share with my family. I stood up, sharply pushing my chair back, and said, "Share? Are you kidding?" She froze, and my dad looked up from his beer. I didn't yell, but my voice was trembling with anger. "You took everything from me. College. My friends. My life. And now that my grandmother has given me a chance, you want to take it away." Mom opened her mouth to say something, but I didn't let her. "You left me here. You didn't even look at me while I was rotting in this room. And now you are my family." The silence that followed was deafening. My dad lowered his head, my mom blushed, but neither of them answered. I went to my room, closed the door, and sat on the floor, hugging my knees. My heart was pounding, and their words were spinning in my head. "We always supported you, you deserved it." Lies. Pure, cynical lies. And the worst part was that I saw them looking at each other, whispering when they thought I couldn't hear. They will not give up. They want this money, this house, this land. They want everything my grandmother gave me. That night I lay in bed and thought about her. About my grandmother. Her drawings, her whispers, her plan. She knew who they were. She saw them better than I did. And she gave me a weapon, not just a legacy, but a power. But what am I supposed to do with it? Forgive them? Throw them out of my life? Or maybe play their game and see how far they go? I heard them talking quietly behind the wall and knew they were preparing something. They would not stop. And I asked myself, will I forgive them? Will I be able to look them in the eye after all this? After that fight in the kitchen, something broke inside me. Not in a bad way, no, it was like a crack through which light finally broke through. I was lying in bed, listening to my parents whispering behind the wall, and I felt my anger giving way to something new. A decision. I was no longer the girl who cried in the car on the way to Florida. I was no longer the one who silently carried boxes and wiped away my grandmother's tears while they lived their lives. My grandmother gave me more than just money, she gave me a chance to become someone else. And I decided that I would not give it back. The next day I got up early. The sun was not yet hot, the air was fresh as it can be in this swamp. I sat down in the kitchen with a cup of tea and opened my laptop. I started to search. Colleges. Programs. Opportunities. My fingers were buzzing with excitement as I scrolled through the sites, reading about admissions, about deadlines. My letter from that dream college had long since become just a piece of paper in a box, but I knew there were other doors. And now I had the keys to open it. $1 million. A house. Land. It's not just numbers, it's freedom. My parents came later. Mom came in first, wearing the same fake smile that had become her mask. "Good morning," she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Did you sleep well?" I didn't answer, just looked at her over the screen. Dad followed, muttering something about the weather. They sat down at the table, and I felt the air tense. They were waiting for me to speak. They were waiting for me to throw them a bone, say something about money, about their support. But I was silent. And it irritated them. Finally, my mom could not stand it. "We talked yesterday," she began, twirling the cup in her hands. "We think you need help. With all this, inheritance. You don't know how to formalize it, how to manage it." Dad nodded, adding, "We can take care of it. So you don't have to worry." I felt a smile, a sharp, ironic one, creeping onto my face. Take over. They wanted to take everything, wrap it in their sticky hands, and leave me with empty pockets. I closed my laptop and looked at them. "I can handle it," I said quietly but firmly. Their faces changed. My mom pursed her lips and my dad frowned. "Are you sure?" she asked, a hint of anger slipping into her voice. "It's a lot of money. You can ruin everything." I stood up, pushing back my chair. "If I screw it up, it will be my choice. Not yours." And I walked away, leaving them sitting in the silence they hated so much. I could hear them looking at each other, my father grumbling, but I didn't care. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control. The same day, I called my lawyer. He was calm, as always, and said that everything was ready for signing. "The house is already mine, the land is being formalized, and the money will soon be transferred to my account." I asked him if my parents could challenge anything. He was silent and then answered, "The will is ironclad. She has thought of everything." I thanked him and hung up, feeling my smile return. She had thought of everything. Grandma. My quiet, sick grandmother, who lay in that bed and wove the net they had trapped themselves in. I started planning. Sell the land, it was worth more than the house because of that development project. Keep the house, but renovate it, make it my own. Or maybe rent it out. I will invest the money in my studies. In the college of my choice. Not the one they will allow me to go to, but the one I want. I was sitting in the backyard, looking at the swamp, and imagining it all. The freedom. A new life. And for the first time in months, I felt myself breathing really, deeply, without that weight on my chest. But my parents did not give up. I could see them whispering, looking at me. One evening, my mother came up to me again, this time without smiling. "You're not going to leave us with nothing, are you?" she said, her voice trembling. I looked at her long, silent and answered, "You chose what family is for you." She turned away, and I knew it was not over. They were waiting. They were waiting for me to give up, to share, to give in. But I wasn't going to. I was standing on the threshold of my new life. Money, house, land, these were my wings. And I decided to fly. But where to go? Sell everything and leave. Or stay here and build something of my own. Or maybe give them a crumb, just to watch them gnaw at it. I didn't know. But I knew one thing, it was my choice. And when I looked at the swamp, at the very landscape that once seemed like a prison to me, I thought, what will I choose? Not for them. For myself. And behind the wall, they were whispering. And I knew that they would not leave quietly. But it was their battle. Not mine.